Greetings, statistics scholars, and welcome to the first in our sequence of videos on chapter number 1, dealing with the collection of data. In our first video this morning, we're going to take a look at section 1.1, which deals with the structure of data, and we'll be looking at cases and variables. We begin with a definition. Each individual item that you record data about can be referred to as one of the cases of our data set. For example, suppose you're interested in studying the colors of cars that people drive. You go out to a college and to its parking lot, and you decide that you're going to record the color of every other car that you see in the parking lot. And when all is said and done, you've taken data on 127 different cars. For each car, you've recorded its color. Now, each of the cars whose colors you noted is considered to be a case in the study. The individual cars are the cases. Now, for every case, we're going to record data values that are of particular interest to us. Those particular features of each case that we record data about are known as the variables. They're called that since their values often vary or differ from case to case. One car may have a red color, another car may have a blue color. Still a third car may have a white color. The color of the car would be referred to as a variable for that car. Now, when it comes to variables, we have a couple of different descriptive words that we use for variables. Sometimes a variable has values that are numeric and that we can perform arithmetic operations on. Those variables we're going to call quantitative variables. For example, suppose that you are studying cats that are being housed at a local animal shelter. And suppose you go and you measure the length of the tail of each of the cats at the shelter. Well, that length of the tail in centimeters, for example, would be an example of a quantitative variable. Those lengths are numbers that we can perform arithmetic on. We could ask, for example, how much longer was the longest cat tail from the shortest cat tail? We could subtract and find the difference. Or we could add up all of the lengths of the tails and divide by the number of cats to find an average tail length for all of the cats. It makes sense to do arithmetic on the tail lengths. And so because of that, we refer to the length of the tail as a quantitative variable. But not all variables are like that. Sometimes variables have values that it doesn't make sense to do arithmetic on. Like, take, for example, our previous example with the colors of the cars. We wouldn't ask what is the difference between blue and green, or what is the average color of all of the cars in the parking lot. Color of car would be an example of a different kind of variable that we call a categorical variable. If you were taking a group of people and asking them the name of the towns that they were born in, those town names would be other examples of categorical variables. And referring back to our previous example of the cats in the shelters, if you went cat by cat and you recorded the breed of each cat, that would be an example of a categorical variable. It wouldn't make sense to talk about the average breed of all of the cats, or the gender of the cats. If we recorded whether the cat was male or whether the cat was female. Those are different categories that the genders fall into. And again, we wouldn't do mathematics with those values the same way we would do mathematics on, say, lengths of tails of the cats. And so there we have it. We have two major types of variables: quantitative variables and categorical variables. And here's another example for us. Now here's a selection of cans that were taken from a pantry in a house. You can see a collection there, A, B, C, D, and E, of 5 different cans that were selected. They contain different things. Some contain vegetables, some contain fruit, some contain pasta or meat or soup. But we can take data about these cases. Now, each one of those cans is referred to as one of the cases in our study. And for every one of those cases, we could record different things. We might be interested in what is the total weight of that can, or we might be interested in what's inside of the can, what's its contents. We might be interested in how many calories per serving are there for that can, or we might be interested in the brand name that is associated with what's in the can. So for example, our first can, can A, which was at the far left, that was a can of tomato soup. So the value of the contents of the can variable for that can was tomato soup. For that same can, it weighed 305 grams. So we would say the value of the weight variable for that can was 305. And so on and so forth. We could record those values for every one of the cans that we've selected. Now in this case here, we have recorded the values for 4 variables. We'd note here that in this case here, the weight of each can in grams and the calories per serving, those would be examples of quantitative variables for this data set. On the other hand, the contents of each can, what's inside, and the brand name for the can, those would be categorical variables for this particular data set. I'd like to ask you to do some thinking with me now about this data set of cans. I've listed 4 variables. Can you think of some other variables whose values someone might record for the values of the cans? Take a moment now and see if you can think of another example of a quantitative variable for a can from a pantry, and another example of a categorical variable, in addition to the ones that were already listed in the previous slide. Have you thought of some? Here are some additional examples that we might come up with. For quantitative variables, the total amount of sodium in the can in grams would be an example of a quantitative variable because we could do math on those numerical values. Or the height of each can in centimeters. That would be another example of a quantitative variable. What about a categorical variable, something that we wouldn't do math on for cans? Well, how about the retailer that the can was purchased from? Maybe it was purchased from Target, or maybe it was purchased from Amazon or Hy-Vee. That retailer would be a category that we wouldn't do mathematics on. Another example of a categorical variable for a can might be whether or not the can has a tab for opening it at the top. That either or, yes or no, that'd be an example of a categorical variable. Very good. Now, one additional thing we want to talk about from section 1.1 are the terms explanatory and response variables. Sometimes when we record data, what we're most interested in is if there are relationships that exist between a pair of variables. We might be curious as to whether the value of one of a case's variables tends to influence the value of another one of its variables. Now, in this case, the variable that's responsible for influencing the value of the other variable is known as an explanatory variable. And the variable whose value was influenced would be referred to as the response variable. So these are 2 vocabulary words that we use. Let's look at an example and talk about our cans from the pantry. Suppose we're talking specifically about cans of tomato soup, and we're recording the brand name of the soup, and the number of grams of sodium in the canned soup. We're recording those two things. Now, in this case, we might be interested in, is there a relationship between the soup's brand and how much salt there is in that can? In this particular case, we would think of the brand of the soup as the explanatory variable and the amount of sodium in the can as the response variable. That's an additional important pair of vocabulary words that we're going to be using going forward as we're talking about data. And that concludes our first video on the subject of collecting data, section 1.1.